Minister, Section 33 of this bill, which I actually believe if you were going to bring about these proposed changes, you should have brought it forward as separate legislation. To actually have Section 33 in the State Airport Shannon Group Bill 2014, when this section is actually going to bring about the most sweeping changes to private pension arrangements in the history of the state. I believe it's the first time actually that a government has proposed legislation to actually change pension benefits in a private pension scheme. I did speak to you in my contribution on the second stage of this bill that we've about 15,000 members of the IASS pension scheme, and as you know how that's made up of Aer Lingus DAA, some former SR Technics workers, effectively split in three, approximately 5,000 active members, 5,000 deferred members and 5,000 retired members. Now, you have set up, and through your department have set up and I use the quote, an expert pension group that is seeking feedback and interaction with those three groups. And this relates to the deficit in the IASS pension scheme. We're well aware, and everyone in this House is well aware, of the significant budgetary deficit within that scheme. But I actually, going back to earlier on this year when your colleague Minister Burton was in the House and she brought forward the Social Welfare and Pensions No. 2 bill, that to me actually signalled what government were about to do to this pension scheme as one of many pension schemes whereby effectively people who had joined this scheme, and by the way they joined under compulsion, most of them signed when they joined the scheme, had to contribute to the pension scheme. And because of the deficit run up within the pension scheme, that now what government are proposing is effectively a drastic reduction in benefits and payment. And this is a private pension scheme. But what you're doing now is allowing, without any agreement being made, is you're bringing forward legislation in a bill here that allows you, and I'm going to quote a couple of items within this particular section, allows you to transfer members out of existing pension schemes to wherever you want them to go, allows you to vary the benefits in payment or the promised benefits in payment. Now let's all recall that this is a defined benefit pension arrangement, that people had signed up for this on the promise of receiving certain benefits at retirement, a guaranteed percentage of final salary as a pension benefit and a guaranteed lump sum. Now, where I have a major problem with this is over the course of the years, and I mentioned this at second stage, during successive governments, Aer Lingus in particular have used this pension scheme as a vehicle to entice people to retire early from the company. And in my view and in my research into this, what they were doing was offering uncoordinated pension benefits at early retirement, meaning that they weren't deducting the social welfare old age pension or contributory pension amount. So it was worth anything up to €12,000 to people who retired early to retire early from that pension scheme. In no way has any of the benefit statements, and I want to talk about the benefit statements, the actuarial valuations or anything like that, have shown any specific payments that Aer Lingus, the DAA or SR Technics, indeed those staff who remain part of this scheme, that any payments were put into the scheme to cover those early retirements. So the company has actually benefited from the early retirements by reduction in costs and reduction in staff costs to the detriment of the pension scheme itself. Now, where most of that is now based on the government's own proposals, which aren't in this bill, but which will be copper-fastened by what governments, by what yourself as Minister for Transport, your Fine Gael and Labour colleagues are proposing to do here, is that someone who's within a year of retirement, and I have cases, and I'm sure these same people have written to you, Minister, who've paid 38 years into their pension scheme, who are expecting a certain amount of retirement, now based on the proposals that are government that are going to have a 50% reduction in the pension benefits and retirement benefits that they will receive in the next year or two. Now, there's a very valid criticism that particularly RASA make, the Retired Aviation members, and those of the Deferred Pensioners Committee, where they haven't had a seat at the table. They haven't been represented by the employer, and they certainly haven't been represented, in my view, by the unions. because these are people who are no longer employed by either of the three companies that I mentioned and who are no longer union members, so they've no one to speak up for them. And the purpose of our opposition to this section is, at the very least, we believe that this section is premature because you haven't come to a final arrangement with regard to what you'll do with the IAS scheme. But what this will be is the biggest stick to beat anyone at negotiations that you can say, and I'll quote on page 30, subsection 11, paragraph B, the consent of the members or of a company or other employer participating in the IAS scheme or of any other person referred to in any provision of the IAS scheme shall not be required by the trustees for the exercise of the powers conferred to them by this subsection. So the members themselves do not have to give their consent to be removed from the IAS scheme. No consent required. Never been done, by the way, to any private pension scheme. Never have government legislation been brought in before, a government bill, to vary the benefits and to remove the entitlements, the perfectly legal pension entitlements that thousands of people have as part of being members of this scheme, and now we're removing their consent. That means that government, and by your conferring on the trustees, the absolute power to remove them from those arrangements. You would have received correspondence, and your colleague, Minister Joan Burton, who's the Minister for Social Protection, who has brought about these changes, as I said, in the Social Welfare and Pensions No. 2 bill. Because not only in that bill, and why this is important, is because you're allowing a scheme being wound down in a single insolvency, where you have a solvent company and a profitable company, and thank God Aer Lingus is, but you're allowing them, because they have an insolvent pension scheme, to actually wind down the scheme, even though they're a profitable company, without insisting on any real payment to deal with the arrears and the deficit in the scheme. Now, at the time when that bill came to this House, I put Minister Burton on notice that this was going to happen with the Aer Lingus scheme, with the IAS scheme. And that bill, the Pensions No. 2 bill, was actually prepared over 18 months ago. And the Minister pulled it at the time because word came out that that was going to happen. So my point is, the employer had advance notice that this was going to happen. So what we're giving, and what government are giving by passing this section here, is free rein to the employer, free rein to you as well as a major shareholder within the company, to not deal with the deficit in the pension scheme, or at the very least to deal with only a small part of it and to write off the rest of the deficit. And how is that going to be written off? It's going to be written off by reductions in payments to retired people, firstly, people who are in their 70s and 80s, who've paid into the scheme and who have no ability to earn additional income, who are retired. Secondly, what you're going to do is you're saying to those people who've paid into the scheme over the course of the years that what we promised to give you under the laws of this country and under the laws and the rules of your own pension scheme that you signed up to and that you contributed to, what's going to happen now is we can reduce your benefits due to be paid by up to 50%, some are saying. But whatever it comes out, we can actually insist upon that happening. Not only that, we can actually remove you from this scheme, because you're setting up a new scheme for the existing members that are there. So the new scheme goes in place, and who's left? The approximately 10,000 people who have no one to represent them at the table are being left with this. I ask you to if you can answer me and tell me one other private pension scheme that government has brought in legislation to remove entitlements of its members. I certainly can't find any, and I believe that this is setting a really, really dangerous precedent. But what it's also doing is causing immense distress to thousands of people who live in Dublin, thousands of people in Shannon, all of those particularly who are expecting a certain level of income at retirement, and now, based on proposals that we're hearing about, it will be less than 50% of what they were expecting. This is, I would ask finally, I'll come in again on this, is that when a person is a deferred member of a pension scheme, they're entitled to access to the trustees' annual report. The Deferred Pensioners Committee and many of those deferred pensioners have told me over the years they have not got copies of the trustees' annual report. They have not received a benefit statement, which they're entitled to under the Pensions Act 1990. They've not received that, and I would also love to know, and well, I do know, who the actuaries for this scheme were. The actuaries for this scheme were KPMG. And the actuaries for part of this scheme were KPMG, and one of the individuals who was actually an auditor of the scheme is actually heading up your expert committee that in relation to the restructuring of the scheme. I'm not going to mention that person, obviously I wouldn't do that. And I'm not impugning that individual at all. I'm sure that that individual is well capable and well experienced of doing this. But if you think about where the suspicion lies with people to say, we never got a benefit statement, if we were a deferred member, we never got access to the trustee's annual report, and the company still will not tell us how much money was paid out in relation to the early retirements, and what was any requisite payment made by the company to fill the hole made by the incentives for early retirement for people from this scheme. So the company used this scheme as a vehicle to reduce their own costs, which they have done, and have done so successfully. And I welcome the fact that the company itself is a profitable company. We all want that to happen. But who is paying for this now? It's the retired members and the deferred members. So I would like to hear your logic behind this, Minister, in proposing this. I'd also like to know as to why this in itself is such a major change, in my view, should have been proposed as a separate bill altogether. And I would ask you, even at this late stage, to withdraw Section 33 in its entirety, because I put it to you that it's premature to do that at this stage, whilst discussions are still going on as to how the deficit in the IAS scheme can be dealt with.